In the early years of the 18th century, when England's harbours thrummed with the noise of timber and tar, and the world seemed both newly discovered and perilously unmeasured, a child was born in a small stone cottage in the Lincolnshire village of Falby. His name was John Harrison. Nothing in his parentage foretold greatness. His father was a carpenter, and his mother kept the household. Their means were modest, their prospects unremarkable. Yet in that humble home, amid the scent of oak shavings and the rhythm of hammer against nail, the boy grew fascinated by a question that few peasants, and even fewer kings, truly understood: how to master time itself. For in his age, time was not the silent constant it seems to us now. It was a fickle, local thing. Church bells marked it, sundials betrayed it, and each village measured it by the passing of its own shadow. To measure time with precision, to make it obedient to human need, was an ambition bordering on blasphemy. But for young Harrison, the ticking of a clock became the heartbeat of the universe. He began, as all apprentices of the craft must, with wood. Metal was expensive, scarce, and often beyond his reach, but the forest provided an abundance of seasoned oak and ash. With a carpenter's instinct, he cut, planed, and fitted the parts of his first timepieces, not from brass, but from the living memory of trees. To the astonishment of those who saw them, these wooden clocks, built in the crude workshop of a provincial joiner, kept time with an accuracy that rivaled London's finest. It was as though Harrison possessed an instinctive comprehension of rhythm and proportion, an ability to hear the invisible pulse that binds all moving parts. Yet his obsession was not content with the simple measurement of hours. He was haunted by a deeper, almost cosmic problem, one that had confounded mathematicians and navigators for generations: the problem of longitude. To know a ship's latitude, one need only measure the height of the sun or the pole star. But to know one's longitude, the east-west position upon the globe, required knowing the exact time at two places simultaneously, where one stood and where one had departed. Every degree of error meant miles of uncertainty, and the sea was merciless to those who guessed wrong. Whole fleets had vanished on uncharted reefs. Men had starved or drowned because the earth refused to reveal its measure. Governments and empires had long sought a solution. In 1714, when Harrison was still a young craftsman, the British Parliament offered a reward of £20,000, an unimaginable fortune, to whoever could devise a method of finding longitude at sea within half a degree. For the merchants of London, it was a question of trade; for the Admiralty, a question of power. But for Harrison, though he was then unknown to them all, it would become the question that defined his life. He did not rush headlong into fame. He was a man of patient temperament, more at ease among gears and pendulums than among patrons. In his early 30s, he built a great tower clock for the parish of Brocklesby Park, a masterpiece that needed neither oil nor constant adjustment, and was said to run with perfect steadiness for generations. Yet even as he tuned its pendulum, he knew that the sea would mock such precision. The motion of a ship, the roll and pitch, the salt and damp, made pendulums useless, and temperature itself altered the very length of metal. To make a clock that could keep true time upon the ocean was, to most minds, an impossibility. But impossibility is the seed of obsession, and Harrison's imagination caught fire at the challenge. He read what little science he could find, borrowing volumes from learned patrons and listening, when allowed, to the debates of the Royal Society. He learned that others sought the longitude through the heavens by observing the moons of Jupiter or the eclipses of stars. Such methods demanded clear skies and steady hands, luxuries a sailor rarely possessed. Others proposed magnetic compasses of uncanny sensitivity, or mechanical devices so fanciful they bordered on the absurd. Harrison, in contrast, returned always to the heartbeat of his craft, the clock. If time could be made constant, utterly, unyieldingly constant, then longitude would yield its secret. Night after night, he sat by the light of a single candle, sketching designs upon scraps of paper. He envisioned balances that would resist the rocking of the sea, springs that would compensate for the contraction of metal in cold, gears so finely cut that friction itself would vanish into silence. His neighbors thought him eccentric, perhaps even touched by divine madness. His tools rang through the village long after the other cottages had gone dark. Yet in that isolation, he trained his mind to think not as a carpenter, but as an engineer of the unseen. Each failure became an education. Each success, however small, a revelation. The first of his marine timekeepers, what we now call H1, would not appear for many years yet, but already the path was set. The young man who had once measured timber by the inch now measured eternity by the second. He spoke seldom of his dreams, for in that age the world was slow to reward invention. The learned circles of London, dominated by astronomers and noblemen, regarded mechanics with a certain disdain. A provincial craftsman meddling with the geometry of the cosmos seemed presumptuous at best, dangerous at worst. Yet Harrison was undeterred. He built instruments to test the expansion of metals and discovered that different metals could be combined to cancel each other's movement with temperature, an insight that would become the foundation of the bimetallic strip. He experimented with lubricants, escapements, and balances until the line between art and science dissolved. By the time he approached his 40th year, the face that looked back at him in the mirror was lean, lined, and lit by an inner intensity. The reward for longitude had drawn many contenders, but none had yet triumphed. Astronomers still peered through telescopes, charting the heavens for signs of salvation. Harrison, meanwhile, hammered brass and filed pivots in a workshop so small that its walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his machines. He was convinced that the sea could be conquered not by sailors, but by seconds. The years passed, and with each tick of the clocks he built, John Harrison drifted further from the ordinary world. His reputation in Lincolnshire grew quietly. Patrons heard of a man who could make time obey him. Yet his mind was already elsewhere, beyond the green fields of his youth, beyond even the island that contained him. He dreamed of oceans. He studied the accounts of sailors lost in fog and storms, of fleets wrecked upon invisible coasts. Time, he knew, was the thread that could weave order from that chaos. If the clock could be made perfect, if it could carry the memory of Greenwich across the restless water, then a captain might know his place upon the globe as surely as if the earth itself whispered it. But perfection is a word that invites torment, and Harrison soon discovered that the pursuit of absolute precision was a kind of spiritual affliction. He began work on what he would later call his first sea clock, the H1. It was unlike any machine ever built. Two great swinging balances replaced the pendulum, each moving in opposition to the other, so that the motion of the ship might cancel itself out. The gears, cut by hand, meshed with such delicacy that the entire mechanism seemed to breathe rather than turn. He spent years perfecting it, dismantling and rebuilding it until its motion was smooth as the tide. Yet he was plagued by doubt. The clock was magnificent in the stillness of his workshop, but would it endure the heaving of the ocean? To prove it, he needed not only courage, but patronage. In 1730, Harrison made the journey to London, carrying with him drawings of his design. It was his first encounter with the heart of the scientific world, the coffee houses where men of letters debated, the galleries where natural philosophers displayed their curiosities, the Royal Society itself, whose members were arbiters of genius and folly alike. To them he was an oddity, a provincial craftsman with rough hands and a Lincolnshire accent, speaking of principles that even learned clockmakers could scarcely grasp. But fortune smiled upon him in the form of Edmund Halley, Astronomer Royal, who saw in Harrison's work a spark of unorthodox brilliance. Halley introduced him to George Graham, London's finest clockmaker, whose name carried weight among scholars and gentlemen alike. Graham examined the drawings, questioned the reasoning, and, to his credit, did not laugh. He lent Harrison money to build his prototype, a gesture that would alter the course of mechanical history. Back in his workshop, Harrison laboured for 5 relentless years, his hands stiff with effort, his eyes strained by candlelight. When the H1 was finally completed in 1735, it gleamed like a creature of both art and logic, brass, wood, and iron assembled into a harmony of motion. The clock was large, nearly 4 feet across, and weighed more than 70 pounds, but it moved with an elegance that seemed almost alive. The Board of Longitude, established by Parliament to judge such inventions, summoned Harrison to London to present his creation. Before the gathered officials and scientists, he explained its workings with nervous precision. They examined it, wound it, and watched as the balances swayed in perfect opposition. It was unlike anything they had seen. To their astonishment, the clock kept near-perfect time throughout its tests, even when shaken and tilted to simulate the motion of a ship. The board authorized a sea trial. Harrison's clock was placed aboard the HMS Centurion for a voyage to Lisbon, and though the journey was short, the results were undeniable. His clock had survived, and time, real time, had travelled with it across the sea. For a moment, it seemed that Harrison's long years of solitude had borne fruit. Yet success, as he soon learned, is never final. The Board of Longitude was cautious. They wanted proof over longer voyages, and they wanted improvement. Encouraged but restless, Harrison returned home and began work on H2. If H1 had been bold, H2 was audacious. He replaced the wooden wheels with brass, refining the mechanism to resist changes in humidity and temperature. He introduced caged roller bearings and further reduced friction, pushing the boundaries of craftsmanship beyond anything his contemporaries could imagine. But even as his skills grew, so too did his anxieties. War with Spain loomed, and the Admiralty forbade the testing of new instruments at sea. The H2 would never make its voyage. For years it sat unused, a gleaming monument to frustrated genius. Harrison, however, did not rest. He was already imagining something greater. He realized that large machines, no matter how ingenious, would never truly conquer the problem. A clock that could save sailors' lives had to be small, durable, and simple enough to be carried by any vessel. He began to imagine a timekeeper, not the size of a chest, but the size of a man's hand. The transformation that followed was not merely mechanical, but philosophical. He was no longer just a carpenter building clocks. He was an architect of certainty in a universe that resisted it. The pursuit of longitude had become a mirror of his own mind, measured, meticulous, unyielding. He labored alone, haunted by the thought that time itself was testing him. Each imperfection in his work felt like a moral failure, each flaw a betrayal of his faith in reason. London's scientific elite began to hear more of this solitary clockmaker from the provinces. Some respected his skill, others mocked his pretensions. Astronomers still believed that the heavens, not machines, held the answer. They published treatises filled with elegant equations, proposing celestial methods so intricate that only a scholar could use them. Harrison's clocks, by contrast, spoke a simpler language, that of motion and balance, of gears and springs. Yet simplicity, in his hands, was deceptive. Beneath the polished brass lay mathematics more subtle than any equation, born not of theory, but of endless trial. He was by nature distrustful of institutions. He kept his secrets close, fearing that others might steal his designs. This secrecy earned him enemies, but it also preserved the integrity of his work. He took few apprentices, and even his own son, William, learned by watching in silence. The relationship between father and son would later become central to the long struggle for recognition, but in these early years, it was forged in shared obsession. Together, they listened to the ticking of the clocks, as though it were the voice of destiny itself. By the late 1740s, Harrison was deep into his third major design, the H3. He was now middle-aged, worn, but resolute. The new clock introduced a radical invention, the bimetallic compensation strip, capable of adjusting automatically to changes in temperature, and a caged roller bearing to reduce friction. Yet each innovation revealed new complexities. The more precise the mechanism became, the more it demanded of its maker. Harrison would wake in the night to scribble adjustments, convinced that perfection lay one fraction of a tooth, one whisper of a spring away. His health suffered, his eyesight dimmed, but his faith in the possibility of mechanical truth never wavered. In those long, candle-lit vigils, he must have felt the paradox of genius. The closer he came to mastering time, the more it consumed him. The clockmaker who sought to conquer the hours had become their captive. By the time the H3 neared completion, nearly 2 decades had passed since John Harrison had first conceived the idea that time itself could guide a ship across the world's oceans. The nation had changed around him. Britain's empire was expanding. Its ships now sailed to every corner of the globe, carrying trade, power, and ambition. Yet every voyage carried the same danger that had haunted mariners for centuries: the invisible peril of misjudged longitude. Ships could calculate their latitude by the sun, but their east-west position remained a guessing game. A single minute's error in time meant 15 miles of uncertainty at sea. To misjudge the hour was to misplace the world. Harrison knew this, and the knowledge drove him with a kind of divine compulsion. His workshop became his cathedral, his benches his altar, the ticking of unfinished mechanisms his liturgy. For him, precision was not a luxury, but a moral necessity. But the H3, despite its brilliance, was never enough. Harrison knew it, even before the Board of Longitude did. Its mechanism, though ingenious, was still too heavy, too intricate, too vulnerable to the ship's motion. He had solved one problem only to uncover another. Yet within that failure lay a revelation. The future would not belong to great wheels and swinging balances. The future of navigation would fit in the palm of a man's hand. And so, against all expectation, the old clockmaker began again. From the ruins of H3, he imagined a new machine, one that would defy every assumption he himself had ever made. The project that would become the H4 began as a whisper of possibility and ended as a revolution. Instead of the massive framework of earlier clocks, Harrison conceived something small, a watch, not a clock, driven by a mainspring and balanced by a tiny, beating oscillator. The very idea seemed absurd. No portable timekeeper had ever achieved accuracy beyond a few minutes a day. But Harrison, whose faith in persistence was absolute, believed that nature could be tamed through understanding, not luck. For 6 years he toiled over the H4, refining each component until the mechanism pulsed like a living thing. Its balance wheel was controlled by a pair of bimetallic strips that expanded and contracted with the temperature, maintaining perfect rhythm. Its escapement, a masterpiece of delicacy, released energy in even, measured breaths. As his fingers shaped each piece, Harrison could sense the years slipping past like sand. He was no longer young. The world that had once ignored him now awaited his results with curiosity, even skepticism. Scientists, astronomers, and mathematicians debated whether a simple craftsman could truly solve a problem that had defied the greatest minds of Europe. Yet Harrison asked for no faith, only time, the one thing he understood better than anyone alive. When the H4 was finally complete in 1759, it was unlike any clock the world had ever seen. Barely 5 inches across, it gleamed with restrained elegance, a fusion of art and science. It was, in essence, a heart of brass that could measure eternity in seconds. When wound, it emitted a steady, confident beat, not the pendulous swing of older clocks, but a pulse, human in its rhythm, precise in its persistence. For the first time in history, a man held in his hand a machine that could carry the certainty of time across the chaos of the sea. But if the machine was ready, the world was not. The Board of Longitude, cautious as ever, demanded proof. They agreed to a sea trial, the most important of Harrison's life. The H4 would sail aboard the HMS Deptford on a voyage to Jamaica, under the care of Harrison's son William. The elder clockmaker, too frail to travel, watched his son depart with a mixture of pride and terror. Years of obsession, humiliation, and hope now hung on the fragile heartbeat of a single machine. For 3 months, the watch endured storms, humidity, and the constant roll of the Atlantic. When William returned, he brought not just the timepiece, but triumph. The H4 had performed with almost miraculous accuracy, losing only 5 seconds over 81 days. The world had changed. Longitude could now be measured not by the heavens, but by the work of human hands. Harrison's obsession had become mankind's salvation. But in that moment of victory, another story began, one of jealousy, politics, and betrayal. The very institutions that had doubted him now sought to diminish him. The Board of Longitude, dominated by astronomers loyal to the celestial method, hesitated to grant the full reward. They demanded further tests, more evidence, more patience. And patience was the one thing John Harrison had already spent a lifetime exhausting. In the solitude of his home, surrounded by the ticking instruments of his triumph, Harrison must have felt both vindicated and betrayed. The clock that had consumed his youth and health now threatened to vanish into the bureaucracy of polite skepticism. Yet even in disillusionment, he could not stop. He began refining the H5, a final act of defiance against those who believed that knowledge belonged only to scholars. In his heart, he knew the truth. He had not merely built a clock, he had built a bridge between earth and heaven, between human ambition and cosmic order. The years of work had transformed him. The humble carpenter who once shaped timber for village halls had become the architect of precision itself. His tools were his scripture, his machines, his gospel. And yet, for all his achievement, Harrison remained an outsider, too practical for philosophers, too visionary for craftsmen, too stubborn for institutions. He belonged to no world but his own. As the candlelight flickered across the face of his last clock, he could see reflected in its glass the long road he had walked, from the quiet fields of Lincolnshire to the halls of Parliament, from the solitude of creation to the loneliness of genius. Every tick of his invention was a reminder that the world had once been ruled by uncertainty, and that one man's obsession had given it order. He had not simply measured time, he had conquered it. Yet even victory, for Harrison, carried the ache of sacrifice. His life had been spent in pursuit of perfection, and perfection, by its nature, can never truly be reached. But history would remember him. In an age of kings and empires, it was not a monarch or a general who changed the world's relationship with the sea. It was a clockmaker, a quiet, relentless soul who believed that time, properly understood, could redeem the chaos of human navigation. His machines would outlast his name for a while, and then his name would return, brighter than before. For though John Harrison built clocks, what he truly created was confidence, the certainty that a man could face the endless ocean and know where he stood upon the earth. And in that certainty, an empire found its way. When John Harrison's H4 returned from its voyage to Jamaica, it brought with it not only proof, but prophecy. For centuries, the sea had mocked the pride of nations, scattering fleets and fortunes upon its indifferent waves. But now, within the polished brass casing of a small, ticking watch, humanity had found the key to its own dominion. Longitude, that invisible thread that stitched the globe together, had been captured, measured, tamed. The news should have echoed like revelation through the halls of power. Instead, it was met with silence, then doubt, and finally, resistance. For in the world of science, as in politics, the birth of a new truth rarely arrives without the death of an old order. The men who sat upon the Board of Longitude were not villains, they were guardians of a faith. For decades, they had believed that the heavens alone could provide certainty. The lunar distance method, a complex calculation based on the position of the moon, was their creed, their scripture, their claim to authority. The idea that a provincial clockmaker, a man with no Latin, no academic title, no membership in the Royal Society, could have solved what they had failed to conquer was intolerable. To accept Harrison's triumph would be to admit that genius could exist outside the academy, that intellect could rise from the workshop rather than the observatory. Thus began the slow unravelling of Harrison's reward. not of money alone, but of recognition, dignity, and peace. The Longitude Act had promised £20,000 to anyone who could devise a method for determining longitude within half a degree at sea. Harrison's H4 had exceeded even that standard. Yet when he appeared before the board to claim the prize, he was told that further tests were required. The officials praised his ingenuity, but questioned his results. Could the success of one voyage prove the reliability of the method? Might the watch have been tampered with? Could it have benefited from chance or fair weather? The objections were endless, and Harrison, who had spent his life in the company of machines rather than men, found himself ensnared in the gears of politics. He was asked to surrender his invention so that others might examine and copy it. An unthinkable request for a man who had labored alone for decades. He hesitated, then refused, insisting that his work be protected until he received fair judgment. To the board, this defiance confirmed their suspicions. They accused him of secrecy, of arrogance, even of deception. The once revered craftsman was recast as a stubborn eccentric, his motives questioned, his integrity doubted. In truth, Harrison's secrecy was born not of greed, but of fear. The fear of theft, of seeing his life's work stripped of its name and handed to the very men who had dismissed him. The board, dominated by astronomers such as Neville Maskelyne, the newly appointed Astronomer Royal, sought to preserve the primacy of the celestial method. Maskelyne was brilliant, meticulous, and utterly convinced that the heavens held the only true measure of time. To him, Harrison's clocks were mere contrivances, clever toys that mimicked nature's rhythm but could never equal it. The conflict between them was not personal at first, it was philosophical, almost theological. But as years passed, it grew bitter. Harrison, now in his late 60s, was forced once again into a trial of endurance. The board demanded that the H4 undergo further testing under the supervision of the Royal Observatory. Maskelyne himself was to oversee the experiment, a decision that guaranteed bias. Harrison protested, but to no avail. The clock was taken from his care and placed in the hands of those who least believed in it. Months turned into years. Reports were delayed, measurements questioned, results revised. Every success was met with a new objection, every triumph with another condition. Meanwhile, Harrison's health began to fail. His hands, once steady as the gears they shaped, trembled with age. His eyesight dimmed, his voice grew frail, but his will remained iron. He continued refining his designs, producing the H5, a masterpiece of precision, the culmination of 50 years of labor. It was smaller, more elegant, and more reliable than any clock he had ever made. When tested under controlled conditions, it performed beyond reproach, keeping time to within a single second over many weeks. But the board still hesitated. They offered partial payments, promises of future consideration, endless bureaucratic evasions. William Harrison, his devoted son, became his advocate and messenger. He had inherited his father's steadiness, but also his temper. Where the elder Harrison saw betrayal as a wound to the soul, William saw it as a challenge to be met with fury. He wrote letters, pleaded before committees, and accused the board of injustice. But the more they fought, the more entrenched the opposition became. In the polite, measured language of 18th century officialdom, the Board of Longitude found infinite ways to say no. By the early 1770s, the struggle had consumed almost 40 years of Harrison's life. The reward remained tantalizingly out of reach. The astronomers continued to promote their lunar tables, and Maskelyne published his nautical almanac, making the celestial method cheaper and more accessible to navigators. The government, seeing an alternative, grew indifferent to the fate of an old clockmaker and his grievances. But history has a cruel way of testing the patience of those who defy it. Harrison was not done. The final years of Harrison's fight unfolded not in workshops or laboratories, but in corridors lined with polished wood and guarded by decorum. It was in these spaces, in the meeting rooms of the Board of Longitude, in the salons of the Royal Society, in the dim offices of Parliament, that the war over truth and recognition was waged. The contest was no longer about a clock, or even about time itself. It had become a battle over legitimacy, over who had the right to define genius. Harrison, a man who measured the world with gears and springs, stood before an establishment that measured it with pedigree and privilege. His son William carried most of the burden now, acting as his father's representative before the board. The elder Harrison's voice had weakened, but his mind remained fierce. Letters written in his trembling hand poured forth, appeals for justice, accusations of deceit, and pleas for simple acknowledgement. In them, one can sense both the precision of a craftsman and the weariness of a man betrayed by his own century. He reminded the board that he had met every condition set before him, that his clocks had endured voyages through the worst seas, that captains and navigators had testified to their perfection. But reason alone was powerless against pride. Maskelyne, ensconced at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, continued to test the H4, ostensibly in the name of science. Yet his reports to the board were shaded with skepticism. He noted minor discrepancies, exaggerated small errors, and questioned the interpretation of results. It was not that the clock had failed, it had not, but that its success threatened the edifice of his own life's work. For if a machine could measure longitude more simply and precisely than the heavens, what need would there be for the Astronomer Royal and his lunar tables? Thus, each success of the H4 was transformed, in Maskelyne's careful prose, into an uncertainty. The conflict between the two men became emblematic of a deeper struggle in the Enlightenment, between the intuitive craftsmanship of the artisan and the abstract authority of the scientist. Both sought truth, but by different paths. Harrison trusted the evidence of his hands, the whisper of a gear, the feel of resistance beneath a file. Maskelyne trusted calculation, theory, and celestial order. Their war was not one of good and evil, but of world views. Yet the power of institutions lay with Maskelyne. His reports were read by Parliament. His word carried the weight of reason itself. Harrison's voice, by contrast, came from the margins, the faint ticking of conscience against the roar of consensus. Still, he would not yield. In 1772, at the age of 79, John Harrison completed his H5 and requested a personal audience with King George III. The monarch, curious and well-disposed towards science, agreed to meet the old inventor at his private observatory in Kew. There, before the most powerful man in Britain, Harrison presented the culmination of his life's work. The king, a man of method and patience, decided to test the timepiece himself. For 10 weeks, he compared the H5 against the Royal Observatory's standard clocks. The results were astonishing. The watch deviated by less than a single second in that entire period. George III, convinced of Harrison's merit, declared, "By God, Harrison, this man has been cruelly wronged." The king's endorsement should have ended the matter, but even royal favour could not erase decades of bureaucratic inertia. The Board of Longitude, though chastised, moved only reluctantly. They granted Harrison a partial payment of £8,750, a gesture meant to silence rather than to honour. It was not the full reward, nor the recognition he had earned, but it was enough to sustain him in his final years. Yet to Harrison, the issue was never money. It was justice. It was the acknowledgement that his life's obsession had changed the world, and that truth could emerge from the hands of a common man. By then, he was an old man surrounded by his machines, his children of brass and wood. They stood upon his tables like sleeping sentinels, each marking the passage of time in perfect rhythm. To others, they were objects of wonder. To him, they were memories, the physical record of half a century's defiance. His house in Red Lion Square became both a workshop and a tomb for unspent invention. He continued to make small adjustments, to polish and recalibrate, as though still haunted by the idea that perfection might yet be improved. Meanwhile, the scientific world outside his door was changing. The Royal Navy, slow to adopt the chronometer, still clung to lunar calculations for decades, but among merchants and privateers, the new age had already begun. The precision of Harrison's inventions spread quietly through the maritime community. Clockmakers in London and abroad began to replicate the design, refining and miniaturizing it. Harrison's genius, denied official reward, began to dissolve into the bloodstream of technology itself. Others would profit, others would be remembered, but none would understand the depth of the sacrifice that had made it possible. William Harrison never forgave the board. He inherited his father's bitterness along with his precision. In letters written long after John's death, he recalled the humiliation of those hearings, the endless evasions, the cold courtesy of men who spoke of fairness while denying it. Yet even in anger, there was pride. He knew what few others did, that his father had altered the destiny of empires. Every chart, every voyage, every safe arrival that followed bore the invisible signature of John Harrison's persistence. As for Maskelyne, history would grant him respect, but not affection. His almanacs continued to serve navigators for generations, but his opposition to Harrison stained his reputation with the odor of envy. The lunar method and the marine chronometer would coexist for many years, but the tide of progress was irreversible. By the dawn of the 19th century, ships no longer looked to the moon for their salvation. They looked to the steady heartbeat of a clock. And yet, for all his vindication, Harrison would die feeling cheated. To the end, he believed the Board of Longitude had stolen not his money, but his meaning, that they had reduced his life's work to a footnote in the records of officialdom. But history, in its slow and impartial way, would restore what institutions had denied. His name, once whispered in the margins, would come to stand for something larger than invention. It would come to represent the triumph of perseverance over pedigree, of labor over lineage, of time itself over those who sought to contain it. In the final years of his life, John Harrison's story took on the air of quiet tragedy, not the kind marked by downfall or disgrace, but by the ache of a man who had reached the truth only to find that the world refused to see it. The betrayal he endured was not a single act, but a pattern repeated over decades. The steady erosion of trust between the visionary and the institution, between the dreamer and those who guarded the gates of recognition. In this, Harrison was not alone. History is filled with such figures, artisans who glimpse the future only to be dismissed by those sworn to cultivate it. Yet in Harrison's case, the irony was profound. His very success had made him a threat. As his health declined, he withdrew into reflection, revisiting his earliest designs with an almost paternal affection. The wooden clocks of Barrow, still marking the seconds with unerring rhythm, were now ancient relics of his youth. To modern eyes they appeared crude, but to Harrison they were living proof of the principle that had guided his entire existence. That perfection was not the gift of theory, but of attention. Each tooth, each pivot, each tiny gear had been carved by hand, and together they had taught him the language of precision long before London's scholars had learned to pronounce his name. In these final years, it was not the board's injustice that haunted him most, but the realization that time itself was indifferent to justice. He often spoke to William about legacy, not the legacy of fame, but of endurance. "It is not enough," he once said, "to build a clock that keeps time. It must teach men to respect it." Those words, recorded by his son, capture the essence of his philosophy. For Harrison, time was not merely a measure of motion, it was a moral force, a discipline that demanded honesty from those who sought to command it. Every failed experiment, every sleepless night spent recalibrating a spring, was not a setback, but a lesson in humility before the laws of nature. To cheat time was impossible, but to understand it, to listen to its rhythm, was to come closer to truth than any title or prize could offer. When he finally passed away in 1776, at the age of 83, the world barely noticed. The newspapers of London were occupied with the rebellion in America, the shifting tides of empire, the affairs of kings. The death of an old clockmaker warranted no headlines. Yet within a generation, the full measure of his contribution began to surface. As Britain's fleets extended their reach across the oceans, the reliability of the marine chronometer became indispensable. Every longitude chart, every safe voyage to India, Every merchant convoy that crossed the Atlantic without disaster owed its precision to the mechanism Harrison had conceived. Without it, the empire itself might have lost its bearings. In 1773, just 3 years before his death, Parliament had awarded him a final sum, a belated acknowledgement of sorts, though they carefully avoided calling it the Longitude Prize. It was an apology without confession, an honour without honour. But in that compromise lay a strange symmetry. The establishment that had resisted him for so long now depended utterly on the fruit of his defiance. The same men who had doubted his clocks now sailed under their protection. The betrayal was complete, yet in that very betrayal lay his victory. For decades after, others would build upon his work. Larkham Kendall, one of the finest watchmakers of the next generation, constructed near-perfect copies of Harrison's H4, each serving aboard British naval vessels as the official timekeepers of empire. These new chronometers were smaller, cheaper, and more uniform, but at their core, they carried the same principles Harrison had forged through half a century of struggle. His design became the template for all that followed, though his name was often omitted from the credit. That, too, was part of the betrayal, the quiet absorption of a man's genius into the anonymity of progress. And yet, history has a peculiar way of healing such wounds. As centuries passed, scholars and historians began to revisit the story of the man who had solved the problem of longitude not with equations, but with patience. The more they studied his life, the clearer it became that his conflict with the Board of Longitude was not merely a technical dispute, but a moral one. It represented the eternal tension between innovation and authority, between those who build and those who judge. In this sense, the betrayal of John Harrison became a parable, a mirror held up to every age that values bureaucracy over brilliance. His clocks still survive. H1, H2, H3, and H4 rest today within the glass cases of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, their gears and escapements preserved like the bones of extinct creatures. Visitors lean close to watch them tick, unaware that each beat represents a battle won against the inertia of history. To hear them is to hear the echo of one man's defiance, a rhythm so precise that it still humbles modern technology. For all the betrayal he endured, time itself has become his most loyal witness. And so, the story of John Harrison ends where it began, in the quiet ticking of a clock. He had set out not to conquer the world, but to understand it, to give sailors a means to trust the sea and themselves. In doing so, he gave humanity a new relationship with time, no longer its victim, but its partner. The kings who ignored him are long forgotten. The boards that denied him dissolved into dust, but his clocks still mark the hours, steady as truth. The betrayal that once seemed to erase him has instead secured his immortality. For in the end, it was not the astronomers, nor the mathematicians, nor the men of influence who triumphed, but the humble craftsman who dared to make time his ally. The year was 1761, and the sound of ticking had become the heartbeat of empires. What began as the private obsession of a carpenter from Yorkshire had now unfolded into a global contest, a race fought not with armies or cannons, but with balance wheels and escapements, with pendulums and patience. The age of discovery had entered its final, most delicate phase, an age when power no longer depended on how far a ship could sail, but on how accurately it could measure the invisible dimension of time. For centuries, longitude had been the phantom of navigation, the invisible enemy that wrecked fleets and drowned men. Now, for the first time, there was a man who had tamed it. Yet as word of John Harrison's miraculous sea clock spread beyond Britain's shores, other nations stirred. The problem of longitude, long thought to belong to the realm of the divine, had suddenly become mechanical, and that made it something that could be copied, stolen, or improved. From the workshops of Paris to the harbours of Cadiz, the ticking of clocks began to echo the rhythm of rivalry. In France, where scientific prestige was both weapon and creed, the news of Harrison's success struck like a challenge. The Académie des Sciences, which had long prided itself on being the intellectual heart of Europe, could not bear the thought that a self-taught Englishman had surpassed their astronomers and engineers. For decades they had favoured the celestial method, a means of measuring time by the dance of moons and stars. It was elegant, mathematical, and, to their eyes, properly French. The notion that a wooden clock could outperform the heavens themselves was, to many, absurd. Yet there were men within France who saw the truth. Pierre Leroy, the gifted son of a royal clockmaker, recognised in Harrison's design a kindred spirit. Leroy's work would become France's answer to H4, a chronometer that used temperature compensation and a detached escapement to preserve its rhythm in the violence of the sea. Though he had begun his research independently, the existence of Harrison's machine spurred him onward, turning his workshop into a laboratory of national pride. Around the same time, Ferdinand Berthoud, another master horologist, emerged as his rival. Berthoud's brilliance was tempered by ambition, and in him France found the mirror image of Harrison's struggle. A man who longed for recognition, but whose inventions were entangled in politics. Thus began a silent war of precision. In London, the Board of Longitude still clung to its skepticism, even as other nations began to adapt Harrison's principles. The irony was bitter. While Britain had the man who had solved the problem, it was others who now raced to claim mastery over his idea. The French government, sensing the potential of timekeeping as an instrument of empire, offered Berthoud a commission to construct marine chronometers for their fleet. His designs, elegant and complex, bore the marks of Harrison's influence, though he would never admit it. Meanwhile, Leroy, more independent but less politically favoured, refined his models in quiet defiance. Between them, the future of French navigation hung in the balance. Their duel, clockmaker against clockmaker, artisan against artisan, became a national drama, unfolding in the salons and academies of Paris as passionately as any battle fought at sea. Across the Channel, Britain watched with wary eyes. The Royal Navy, newly empowered by victories in the 7 Years' War, knew that the ability to determine longitude was more than a scientific curiosity. It was a weapon. A fleet that could know its position with certainty could strike anywhere, resupply without error, and avoid the reefs and storms that had claimed countless lives. Timekeeping, once a philosophical pursuit, had become a matter of strategy. In the dockyards of Portsmouth and Deptford, officers whispered of the new time, a world in which the smallest cog could shape the fate of nations. Yet the British establishment, ever slow to reward its visionaries, hesitated to fully embrace Harrison's methods. The board's obsession with astronomical purity led them to fund parallel experiments, rival clocks, rival theories, rival men. The result was a paradox. Britain held the secret to global navigation, but refused to see it clearly. And so the race widened. In Spain, the empire that had once ruled the oceans now sought to reclaim its place through science. Spanish mathematicians studied translations of British reports, attempting to reconstruct the principles of the chronometer from fragments and rumour. In the Netherlands, a handful of instrument makers experimented with pendulum regulators adapted for the rolling decks of ships. Even in Sweden and Russia, where maritime expansion was in its infancy, governments offered prizes for any device that could rival the English marvel. The quest for longitude became the Enlightenment's grand obsession, a fusion of craftsmanship and intellect, of national ambition and human pride. Everywhere, the clockmaker had become the new alchemist. By the 1770s, the competition had reached fever pitch. Harrison's H4, now tested and vindicated, was being replicated by other English craftsmen, Larkham Kendall foremost among them. His copy, known as K1, was so exact that Captain James Cook carried it aboard the Resolution during his voyages into the Pacific. It was there, at the edge of the known world, that the full power of the chronometer was revealed. Cook's charts, drawn with mathematical clarity, transformed the vague outlines of continents into precise coastlines. The world, once vast and uncertain, was suddenly measurable. Longitude, once the terror of sailors, had become a number, a coordinate on a map, a certainty drawn from the pulse of a clock. The age of mystery was giving way to the age of mastery. Yet as Britain celebrated, others plotted to catch up. The French Navy, humiliated by its losses in the 7 Years' War, poured resources into improving its chronometers. Berthoud, now the official horologist to the king, produced a series of magnificent instruments, each one a masterpiece of brass and steel. He published treatises, courted patrons, and sought to prove that France, too, could command time. His rival Leroy accused him of vanity and theft, claiming that Berthoud had stolen ideas from his private experiments. Their feud divided the French scientific community, much as Harrison's conflict with the board had divided Britain's. Behind the rivalry lay a deeper truth, that timekeeping had become the new frontier of empire. Every nation that built a better clock extended its reach across the globe. Every tick was a declaration of sovereignty. In London, the political winds were shifting. Harrison was old now, his triumph overshadowed by bureaucratic fatigue. He had his recognition, but not his peace. The board, though defeated in principle, remained cautious in praise. It was the younger generation, men like Kendall, Arnold, and Earnshaw, who would carry his designs forward. Thomas Earnshaw, in particular, would simplify the chronometer's mechanism, transforming it from a marvel of craftsmanship into a reproducible tool of navigation. What had begun as an art was becoming an industry. The race, once personal, was now systemic, a machine racing against itself. Meanwhile, the philosophical implications of this triumph rippled through Europe. The Enlightenment, that great chorus of reason, began to see in the chronometer a symbol of its own ideals. If time could be measured so precisely that the oceans themselves could be mapped, then perhaps nothing lay beyond human comprehension. The heavens, the earth, and even the sea could be brought into order through patience and intellect. But for others, this mastery inspired unease. The old relationship between man and nature, that delicate dance of uncertainty, was fading. The sea, once mysterious, was being tamed by machines. The stars, once guides of destiny, were being replaced by ticking mechanisms hidden in brass cases. Some saw it as liberation, others as the beginning of man's estrangement from wonder. As the 18th century drew to its close, the race for longitude became the foundation of a new global order. Britain's mastery of the chronometer gave it an advantage so decisive that its fleets could sail with impunity. Every voyage was now a calculated movement, every attack a matter of timing. Napoleon, years later, would lament that Britain's empire was not built merely on ships, but on 500 watchmakers. And indeed, the empire's reach was measured in hours, the time it took to cross oceans, to calculate tides, to deliver goods, troops, and orders with mechanical precision. In this way, the legacy of Harrison's invention transcended its maker, shaping not only science, but civilization itself. The race, however, never truly ended. Long after Harrison and his rivals were gone, nations continued to refine the art of timekeeping. In the 19th century, observatories became temples of precision, their instruments synchronized to clocks descended from Harrison's lineage. The Greenwich meridian, chosen as the world's prime line of longitude, stood as both tribute and irony. The very institution that had once doubted him now served as the 0 point for all of time and space. In Paris, where pride still stung, the Bureau des Longitudes sought to reclaim leadership, building chronometers of exquisite delicacy. But the tide of history favoured the English standard, and soon the world's maps aligned with Greenwich. The invisible race had found its finish line, marked not by flags or fortresses, but by the slow, relentless motion of a clock hand crossing 12. In the end, what had begun as a challenge of science had become a metaphor for human progress itself. Every advance, from the pendulum to the spring, from the chronometer to the telegraph, was part of the same race, a race against uncertainty, against chaos, against the fear of being lost. Harrison's clocks did more than measure time, they measured confidence. They allowed humanity to look outward, to cross oceans without trembling at the thought of the unknown. And though his name was once buried under the weight of institutions, time, his eternal ally, restored him. Each century since has drawn closer to his precision, each invention a distant echo of that first impossible dream, to hold the universe in rhythm, to know where we stand in the vastness of creation. Today, when satellites orbit the Earth and atomic clocks divide seconds into infinities, we still live in the shadow of that race. Every GPS coordinate, every digital timestamp, every plane that crosses the sky owes a debt to that humble craftsman who refused to surrender to uncertainty. The kings who once scoffed at him are dust, the academies that denied him mere footnotes, but his vision endures, steady, unbroken, as constant as the beat of time itself. The race continues, though its contestants have changed. And in the silent ticking of every modern clock, there is still, faintly, the echo of John Harrison's heartbeat, the sound of one man racing not against others, but against eternity. In the centuries that followed John Harrison's death, the quiet pulse of his clocks continued to echo through the chambers of progress, whispering a truth that the world would only gradually learn to hear. That mastery over time was mastery over destiny itself. His invention, once dismissed as the eccentric work of a provincial artisan, became the foundation upon which the modern world was built. Empires rose and fell in rhythm to the beat of mechanisms inspired by his hands, and the very concept of time, once local, fluid, and subject to the whims of sun and shadow, hardened into something universal, mechanical, and absolute. It is difficult now to imagine the immensity of the transformation. Before Harrison, time was a matter of place. Each town, each church steeple, each harbour set its own hour by the movement of the sun. Noon in London was not noon in Bristol, and ships that sailed beyond the horizon entered a realm of uncertainty where distance and direction blurred. After Harrison, that uncertainty began to vanish. The ocean, once an abyss of guesswork, became a grid. The heavens, once the only map, yielded to the human-made precision of brass and balance. A clock had made the world measurable. For Britain, this new precision was power. The Royal Navy's supremacy in the 19th century was not born solely from its guns or its discipline, but from its mastery of navigation. Each ship carried a chronometer, a descendant of Harrison's H4, secured in gimbals, wound daily with reverence, and checked before every voyage against the official time signal at Greenwich. By the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, these timekeepers had become symbols of national pride. When the iron hulls of steamships replaced the oak of sailing vessels, when telegraph cables stitched continents together, and when the first railways thundered across the countryside, it was the chronometer's precision that allowed it all to function in harmony. Schedules, trade, communication, all depended on a shared understanding of time, and that understanding could be traced, gear by gear, to the workshop of a man once scorned as a tinkerer. Harrison's legacy was not merely technical, it was civilizational. He had done for time what Gutenberg had done for words, made it reproducible, reliable, and universal. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich became the temple of this new order. From its hill above the Thames, astronomers broadcast the time to the entire empire. Each day, at precisely 1 o'clock, a red ball atop the observatory's roof dropped, signalling the exact hour to ships anchored below. Sailors would adjust their chronometers accordingly, synchronizing their voyages to the heart of empire. In 1884, when representatives of the world's powers gathered in Washington to decide upon a single prime meridian, it was Greenwich that was chosen, not merely for its geography, but for its authority over time itself. Longitude 0 was now English. The very framework by which humanity measured its position on Earth had been defined by the invention of a carpenter from Yorkshire. Harrison, who had once fought for recognition from his own government, had unwittingly given his nation the greatest instrument of dominion imaginable, control over time. Yet the true measure of his legacy extended far beyond national borders. The age that followed was one in which time became the architecture of existence. Factories organized their labor by clocks, railways synchronized their timetables, and cities pulsed to the regularity of whistles and bells. The human day, once guided by natural rhythm, was now subdivided into minutes, seconds, and shifts. In this mechanization of life lay both progress and loss. The world grew efficient, but also restless, precise, but impatient. The same instrument that had freed sailors from the tyranny of uncertainty had bound ordinary people to the tyranny of punctuality. Harrison could never have foreseen it, yet his invention had set in motion the very tempo of modernity, a world forever aware of the seconds slipping through its fingers. Still, the philosophical beauty of his triumph remained. To master time is to glimpse eternity, and Harrison, in his humble pursuit, had bridged the gap between the finite and the infinite. His clocks did not simply mark moments, they affirmed that within the chaos of the universe, order could be found by human hands. In an age that still believed the heavens governed fate, he had shown that reason, persistence, and craftsmanship could rival celestial perfection. His legacy thus became the spiritual foundation of the scientific age. Every instrument of precision that followed, from the telescope to the particle accelerator, carried his principle, that truth could be built, that wonder could be engineered. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, the race for precision continued in new forms. The mechanical escapement gave way to the quartz crystal, and the gentle tick of gears was replaced by the invisible oscillation of electrons. Atomic clocks, accurate to billionths of a second, redefined the boundaries of time itself. Satellites, orbiting high above the planet, synchronized every phone, every aircraft, every nation. The problem of longitude, once the torment of explorers, now resolved itself effortlessly in the pocket of every traveler through GPS, a technology that owes its very existence to the principle Harrison proved, that time and position are inseparable. Each signal sent from space is stamped with a moment so precise that the receiver on Earth can determine its place within meters. Every navigation app, every plane's autopilot, every ship crossing oceans carries within it the ghost of Harrison's insight. His mechanical heartbeats have become digital pulses, his brass wheels transformed into silicon circuits, yet the idea remains unchanged, that to know time is to know one's place in the world. And yet, for all our progress, there is a quiet irony in the arc of his legacy. The man who devoted his life to perfecting time did so not to enslave humanity to it, but to liberate it. He wanted sailors to survive, explorers to return home, and knowledge to expand without fear of the unknown. Today, though his invention has made the world faster and smaller, it has also made it more frantic. The seconds he preserved have become the very units we race against. In a sense, the kings he forced to race against time were only the first contestants in an unending contest, one that continues in every factory, office, and screen. The precision that once saved lives now dictates them. It is as if the chronometer, having conquered the sea, turned inward to command the human soul. And yet, amid this paradox, there remains something sacred in the ticking of a clock, a reminder that time, for all its dominance, still whispers of mortality, of purpose, of the delicate balance between control and surrender. Harrison himself could never have imagined the reverence with which his name would one day be spoken. In 1776, the world had barely taken notice of his death. 2 centuries later, his story would inspire books, films, and museum exhibits. Scholars would trace the evolution of his designs, marvel at the ingenuity of his escapements, and stand in awe before the survival of his original timepieces, H1 through H4, each restored to motion, each still keeping time with astonishing accuracy. Visitors to the Royal Observatory today can watch them tick behind glass, their steady rhythm bridging the centuries. In those moments, one feels an intimacy with history itself, as if time, once conquered, now turns kindly to honor its conqueror. The legacy of Harrison also lives in a deeper, more abstract form, in the idea that genius may emerge from the margins. He was not a scholar nor a gentleman of science, nor a man of privilege. He was a carpenter who listened closely to wood and metal until they spoke their secrets. His victory was as much moral as intellectual, a triumph of persistence over prejudice, of humility over hierarchy. In every generation since, inventors, engineers, and dreamers have found in his story a reflection of their own struggles against authority. He proved that truth does not require permission, that the measure of a man's worth lies not in the titles bestowed upon him, but in the precision of his work and the sincerity of his pursuit. In that sense, his clocks are not merely instruments of navigation, they are instruments of justice, each tick a rebuke to the arrogance of those who once dismissed him. As the 20th century waned and the 21st dawned, the symbolism of time took on new meanings. Humanity, now connected in ways unimaginable to Harrison, began to live by a single global time. The sun still rose and set, but civilization revolved around coordinated universal time, a creation of laboratories, satellites, and algorithms. Midnight in London corresponded to morning in Tokyo and dusk in San Francisco. The world had at last achieved what the Enlightenment had only dreamed of, a single heartbeat. Yet beneath this synchronization lay a question older than science itself. What truly is time? Is it merely a sequence of measurable moments, or something vaster, more elusive? Harrison's life, in its devotion to the measurable, seemed to suggest that through precision one could approach truth. But his legacy, in its poetry, reminds us that precision itself is never the end, only a language through which we glimpse the eternal. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of John Harrison is not that he taught mankind to keep time, but that he taught it to listen to it. His clocks, with their soft, steady ticking, are like voices in an endless conversation between humanity and the cosmos. They remind us that time is not an enemy to be conquered, but a companion to be understood. When his first sea clock marked the passing of a second, it did more than solve a problem. It united the infinite vastness of the ocean with the intimate rhythm of a heartbeat. Every beat since, whether of a mechanical balance or a human pulse, carries that same lesson, that in precision lies meaning, and in patience lies truth. And so, as the world continues its race, faster, louder, more relentless than ever, the story of John Harrison endures as a quiet counterpoint. It speaks of a man who, in an age of kings and conquests, sought no crown but perfection, no empire but understanding. His victory was invisible, yet absolute. He forced the greatest powers of his age to reckon with the smallest unit of existence, the second, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to rule. The kings are gone, the wars forgotten, but the clocks remain. They measure not just hours, but humanity itself, our striving, our failures, our endless desire to know where we stand in the grand expanse of time. To stand before one of Harrison's clocks today is to feel that paradox made visible. Motion born of stillness, eternity contained within brass. The pendulum swings, the escapement clicks, and the hand advances. A slow, steady assertion that the universe, for all its chaos, can be measured, understood, and perhaps even loved. In that rhythm lies the true meaning of his legacy. For every age will have its races, against ignorance, against distance, against time itself. But only a few will have the courage to stop, to listen, and to build something that endures. Harrison did. And because of that, every second that passes carries his name.